There are a lot of ways in which Johnson kind of falls short of his own ideals, and he's more aware of this than really anyone else. For example, like he believed that church attendance and church community was important, but he hated going to church. He's like, oh, these sermons are so boring, and I would rather read by myself and do my private devotions. But the charity is one way in which I think his life really kind of speaks for itself. He was always kind of hard up for money. One of his famous quips, he was a great conversationalist, is that no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. And so he was kind of always on the edge. One thing that he did do, there's a woman named Anna Williams, who is this blind Welsh spinster. He took her into his home. He had this habit of, even though he himself was kind of financially precarious, he gathered together all sorts of people who were sort of at the fringes of society and gave them a home. So Anna Williams was one. There's a freed Jamaican former slave named Francis Barber, who also lived with him. Johnson paid for his education and included him in his will. He was part of the kind of abolition movement in England at the time. He made a practice of kind of walking home late at night. If he saw children sleeping on the road, he would put a penny in their hands while they were sleeping so that they would wake up in the morning and have money to buy breakfast. So good works was really an important part of his faith, and that was one way he lived up to it, I think.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Overtones podcast. I'm LaRae, and I'm here today with my co-hosts, Joe and Christy.
Hi, guys.
Hello there. If you're new to the podcast, our goal is to investigate and celebrate the diverse unity of the Christian church around the world.
That's right. We speak to academics, church workers, and lay people from across the global church in order to highlight lesser heard voices and grow in love for our brothers and sisters around the world.
Today, we're delighted to have with us on the podcast Dr. Kirsten Herlin, who's here to tell us about the life of Samuel Johnson and his example of faithful Christian engagement in a secular culture. So welcome, Kirsten. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy for an excuse to hang out with LaRae and now Joe and Christy virtually.
Absolutely. It's a real privilege. So Kirsten, can you just start by introducing yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so a little bit about me. LaRae and I went to college together at Hillsdale, so we go way back. It's nice to be reunited. And when I was at Hillsdale, I studied English, and I always was kind of drawn to 18th century literature. So I knew pretty early on that I wanted to go on to get a PhD in that subject. So after graduating, I went to UT Austin. I did my PhD in 18th century British literature, specifically about how 18th century novelists were trying to come up with a new sort of form of Christian heroism to rival classical heroism. So after graduating, I was an assistant professor at Ave Maria University for 2 years. And now I'm at the University of Austin, which is...
And will you be primarily lecturing in 18th century literature, or will it be a bit broader?
It'll be a bit broader, but next year I'm excited because I think I'm teaching a class called Reason and Revolution, which kind of covers the intellectual history of France and England during the Enlightenment. So that's my bread and butter.
Great. Well, you said that your PhD was in 18th century literature. How did you come to be interested in that area? What kind of drew you to that?
That, in some ways, is the question I've been asking myself and trying to figure out through this whole process. Maybe I'll get a satisfying answer one day. I think one of the most immediate things was that in middle school, a friend introduced me to Jane Austen. And I was reading Austen's kind of earliest novel that she finished and sold to be published. It wasn't published till after her death, Northanger Abbey. And Northanger Abbey was a bit of a revelation for me because it's a book kind of about reading books. It's a sort of, if Jane Austen wrote Don Quixote, right? So this character has been reading all of these novels. And for me as a, middle schooler, high schooler, I was like, these are actual novels I've never heard of before, and I can actually read them. So this idea that Austen was reading and engaging with these other writers sort of opened up this whole world. And so I just decided to explore that, and I was kind of hooked. And that's kind of how I became interested in Johnson as well. Johnson, that was something I was introduced to in college. And I remember reading, I think it was Rasselas for a class and hearing the professor lecture on it. And I thought, you know what, there's something really special here and really profound, but I don't think that I quite understand or am ready, maybe in a few years. But I knew that there was something important there. And so in grad school, I kind of returned back to Johnson. And it turns out that Johnson was one of Austen's favorite writers. There's a note that her brother wrote in actually the preface to Northanger Abbey and Persuasion when they were published after her death. It was the biographical notice. And he called Johnson one of her favorite moral writers in prose. And we have a moment in one of her letters where she refers to him as her dear Dr. Johnson. So,
Aww. So the main thing I remember about Samuel Johnson is that he wrote a dictionary, but I know he wrote a lot of other things. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of his works that are lesser well known?
Sure. Yeah. So just a little bit about Johnson. He's not as well known today, which is a great tragedy. And that's what I'm aiming for. I want Johnson to be better known again. But he was one of the great men of letters of the 18th century, right? He was really at the center of the English Enlightenment. He was personally friends with some of the other great thinkers of that period. Adam Smith, he knew Edmund Burke. They were in a club together. He was friends with the great portrait painter, Sir Joshua Reynolds. He was kind of aware of David Hume and Voltaire, and they were aware of him. So he was really at the center of things. And he was so famous that the middle, kind of later part of the 18th century is sometimes known as the age of Johnson, right? So he's an era-defining figure. And as LaRae mentioned, right, he's best known today as writing the first true English dictionary. And this is a really interesting story. He was approached by a group of booksellers to put together a real English dictionary. And so there were other English dictionaries before. They were mostly kind of wordless, or if they were offering definitions, they weren't very good. My favorite example is an earlier dictionary that defined a horse as a beast well known. So it's like, you better know what a horse is. Right, it's not a real definition. So Johnson was kind of single-handedly tasked with writing England's first true dictionary, and this was supposed to rival the French dictionary that their academy was working on. And just to kind of put things in perspective, the French Academy had a 40-member team, and that took them about 40 years to write this dictionary. Johnson did it by himself, working in, the garret of a house in London with a team of kind of Scottish hack writers who helped him kind of transcribe it. It took him 9 years to do it. And it had 40,000 entries with illustrative quotations. And this has been since the foundation of all other English dictionaries, including the Oxford English Dictionary and Webster's Dictionary. So Johnson, he was known as Dictionary Johnson. This made his fame, but he was also famous in his day as a kind of great Christian moralist. And I think that Christianity was really central to his thought. And so we know him as a dictionary writer. Even the dictionary is filled with kind of religious quotations. So he managed to turn even this document into a kind of religious text in some ways, that people could look up a word and they would have a kind of edifying quote from, a 17th century sermon or a kind of Anglican poem to kind of digest. So even the dictionary had a kind of Christian subtext to it.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I find it intriguing because I work on 17th century and all the way to maybe the early 18th century. And I think in my mind, I think also like for a lot of people who know about Enlightenment in 18th century, there's this impression that we are going on some kind of like a spiritual decline. There's a thesis of decline. And that is also traditionally tied up with the rise of capitalism, a lot of other things. So can you tell us a bit more about the big cultural forces at work in Johnson's day? And, maybe a little bit more about the Enlightenment as well, like how the Enlightenment ideas shape and shape culture, and how did Christians like Johnson respond?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think this is part of why Johnson is a kind of enduring figure and offers Christians today resources. Because, you're exactly right. The Enlightenment, the traditional story of the Enlightenment, that this is religion in decline, right? People are replacing their faith in God with faith in the natural sciences. And that's true to some extent, but I kind of prefer the Charles Taylor thesis, which is that there are kind of more options for belief than ever before. It's never that Christian belief ever fully goes away. It's still a very prominent part of English life, right? You still have the Church of England and you've got a lot of really powerful thinkers, but there are these new currents, right? You've got someone like David Hume, who is, a real skeptic and is kind of undermining people's faith. And yeah, so Johnson, he's really at the center of this. One thing that Johnson did that's kind of interesting is that he would ghostwrite sermons for his friends.
Oh, wow.
Really?
He wrote about 40 sermons, and about 27 of them survive and they've been published. And he didn't take credit for them in his day, but now we know that he wrote these. But I recently came across a quote from one of his sermons that I can just read.
Fascinating.
He wrote, "The prevailing spirit of the present age seems to be the spirit of skepticism and cautiousness, of suspicion and distrust, a contempt of all authority and presumptuous confidence in private judgment, a dislike of established forms merely because they are established, and of old paths because they are old." Right. So he was aware of this. And another thing that Johnson said that's always struck me, Johnson, in addition to writing a dictionary, is the subject of one of the most famous biographies ever written, Boswell's Life of Johnson. And there's a conversation that they're having about David Hume, right, the great kind of infidel. Johnson says, if I wanted to write against Christianity like Hume does, I could have done that. Right. Everything that Hume has said about Christianity has passed through my mind. Right. None of this is new. I've thought of it all before. So Johnson, I think, is such an interesting figure because he was aware of all of the arguments against Christianity. He himself was a lot like David Hume in that he had this very probing, skeptical mind. He believed in the powers of reason. Yet, in spite of all of this, he kind of held on to his faith and chose to kind of believe in spite of some of these arguments. Yeah, so I think in terms of Christians today, looking to figures who struggled to live in a culture that was hostile to their beliefs, right? There's no one better than Johnson, right? Johnson spent his life kind of battling against his culture, but also battling against himself, his own doubts. He never gave up, right? If you look at the prayers and the diary entries that we still have today, through his whole life, there are these resolutions to keep reading the Bible, resolutions to subdue his will, right, and his mind to greater obedience to God. There's an entry about against perplexing thoughts. He was always asking. He was a true kind of pilgrim in that way. He never was fully contented, but he also never stopped persevering. He never gave in to despair. Even if he never,
so
he failed. This was his lifelong project.
You kind of already started to answer this, but are there clues in his biography perhaps as to kind of how he managed to hang on to his faith? It sounds like maybe some spiritual disciplines like daily Bible reading was one. Were there more that you've picked up on?
I think so. So Johnson was a big believer in authority. So when he experienced doubts, right, about faith, I think maybe he assumed that the problem was with him, that there was this, he took a lot of courage and a lot of stock in the kind of Christian tradition. So he was really well versed in the church fathers. And I think, Johnson was extremely aware of the way that your imagination and your fancy can kind of deceive and run away from you, and the lengths that people will go to justify their own desires, their own beliefs. And so he didn't really have a lot of trust in himself in that way. And so he thought that church authority was really important and a kind of stabilizing force. I think he thought of his own doubts as a way that his mind was trying to deceive itself.
That speaks to the power of community as well, I think, and identity as well, kind of being part of the church and the church through time being a really stabilizing force. That definitely makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Community was really important. Church tradition, church authority. Johnson also kind of famously hated going to church, even though he knew it was important and he advocated for it. And he was very critical of religious dissent in England
So he's an Anglican.
He's a high church Anglican, believes in, the Church of England as a kind of state institution. He believes in ecclesiastical order. So he was critical of the Puritans. He thought they were a kind of destabilizing force in the previous century.
Right. So what
Yes.
type of high church are we talking about theologically?
He was an Arminian.
Right.
Yeah, so he didn't believe in predestination. He didn't think there was a scriptural basis for it. He believed in universal atonement.
Okay.
Believed
I
in good
see.
works. Charity was very important.
It's been really interesting hearing how Johnson knew kind of what the right thing to do was, but from the inside didn't really want to do it, but still did it.
Yeah.
I wonder if that changed him, because I know of lots of stories where Christians have struggled to love people or struggled to do the right thing, but actually have benefited from just saying, "Oh, I will do this." And then God kind of working through that to change their heart and their heart posture towards other people. Do you know if Johnson also kind of changed in a sense from time as the years went on, as he carried on doing these good works?
To be honest, I don't think it ever got easier for him.
Hmm.
I mean, Johnson was a very intense kind of person. He was also very melancholic, and he struggled from what we would now diagnose as depression, maybe bipolar disorder. Obviously, they didn't have a diagnosis like that back then. He called it his vile melancholy, or the general disease of his life. It was debilitating. He always thought he was constantly at the edge of madness. So one of his great fears was losing his reason. There's a story shortly after the dictionary was published, and he was kind of like, I've accomplished this great feat. What is my next thing? And a couple of his friends went to his lodgings, and they found him with a clergyman kind of on his knees, begging for him to be able to hold on to his reason because he was so beset by these inner demons. So, I'd like to believe that the kind of perseverance pays off. Your heart is kind of converted, and it becomes more sort of enjoyable to do the things that you didn't want to do. But unfortunately for Johnson, I don't think that was ever the case. I think it was always hard. But what I think really remarkable is the way that he never gave up. Even though he failed kind of again and again, he just kept on going. Again, the diaries are filled with these resolutions.
That's excellent.
And the resolutions never really change. It's always the same kind of thing. Even close to dying, there's a prayer in which he asks God to forgive him for his late conversion.
Wow.
So I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, because he was a practicing Christian. He had a kind of brief atheist period when he was in his teens. Sort of that period of his life is very haunting to him. I don't think he ever got over that. He was not really comfortable talking about it. But I think he always saw himself as in this process of conversion, perhaps.
Thank you, Kirsten. I found that very interesting, and I think it could be very encouraging to a lot of our listeners as well. If we could just dig a little bit deeper into his mind and the struggles that he has throughout his life, what are the recurring thoughts, those that can sort of help us understand a little bit more about why it was so hard for him?
I think he had as I sort of mentioned earlier, he had a pretty skeptical turn of mind. This is something he had in common with David Hume. He always wanted reasons for things. So there's an interesting, and this is something I haven't entirely figured out, but he believed on one hand that Christianity and the doctrines of Christianity were the highest form of reason, right? And that reason, right? In this way, he's very much a man of the Enlightenment, and he does believe really strongly in the power of reason. But I also, you look at his writing and you look at the biographies and the life of Johnson, and there is a sense in which I think he also recognizes that reason is not always sufficient, right? And that there are mysteries that reason can't always explain. And that's something he had a very hard time reconciling.
That was helpful to know.
He was a terrible procrastinator.
Really?
He has a great little essay in The Rambler, which was one of his it was a periodical series he wrote. And it's a great essay on procrastination. I highly recommend.
I gotta read that. Okay.
But he really, he wrote it for himself because he was the worst procrastinator of all time. He needed to write an essay because it was due that morning. And he's like, so I wrote this essay about procrastination.
Well, he got a sense of humor.
Oh, yeah. Johnson was a very funny person. There's a sentence that I like. Marriage has many pains, but celibacy has no pleasures. Sentences, witty sentences like that.
Kirsten, thanks so much. We've talked a lot about Johnson, about how he found things. Could you tell us a little bit more about what do you think is Johnson's legacy as you see it today? What do you think the impact he's had on society back then, but also now might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think today, I think that Johnson has a lot to offer today, more than just the dictionary, although the dictionary is really enough to be the foundation of anyone's legacy. But yeah, I mean, I think especially for us as Christians, Johnson is a really kind of compelling figure. I think that he offers people hope. Just reading about his life, reading his work. He actually said, Johnson, he was the subject of a great biography, but he also wrote biographies and wrote about biography. It was one of his favorite genres. And he said that if biographies only showed the bright parts of a great man or great woman's character, the reader would probably fall into despair, right? You have to show the light and dark in a person
Yes.
if you want to give them hope. And I think someone like Johnson, really, I would love to see him have a kind of, like a renaissance or a new following, because I do think, again, he lived in an age that was hostile to Christianity. He was really at the center of some of those intellectual currents. He considered them deeply himself. He wrestled with them, but he managed, I think, to live a faithful life. And I think he deserves more recognition today as a great Christian thinker. And sometimes that can be obscured too in contemporary scholarship, who saw him as a kind of great humanist, but tend to downplay his religious thought.
You mentioned at the start of the podcast that he had quite an impact on Jane Austen. Would you care to elaborate on that at all?
This is the subject of a book I'm working on right now. It's based on a class that I taught my last semester at Ave Maria. My students really loved it. This is partly a way to get students interested in Johnson. Jane Austen is a little bit of the hook. She already has a very robust fan base, but really I want people to discover Johnson's thought through Austen. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of overlapping concerns that they have. I think that Johnson, if you read Johnson's work side by side with Austen's novels, you can see the way in which he sort of helped to form her moral imagination. They're very interested in kind of the virtue of patience, in getting through difficulties. And none of this is new to Johnson, right? He's coming out of this long Anglican Christian tradition. And I think that Austen is a part of that. Another example would be that Austen is really interested in self-examination as a part of the moral life and in self-knowledge. And I think, like Johnson, is hyper aware of the ways in which man is fallen and man is sinful and man is capable of going to great lengths to deceive himself about his own flaws, right? So pride is the kind of great vice, both in Johnson's thought and Christian thought more generally, but in Austen's novels. Mary Bennet is this kind of pedantic character, and she said, I believe that many people, that pride is a very common failing indeed. And she said it in a very banal way, but I actually think that's kind of key to the novel, is the way that people are prideful in order to kind of deceive themselves. And so Elizabeth's kind of the turning point, the moral heart of the novel is when she realizes that she's been completely wrong about Mr. Darcy, Mr. Wickham, and she says, till this moment, I never knew myself. And she has to go through this kind of process of mortification. And, she could have gotten it in other writers. There were certainly a lot of Anglican divines who emphasized self-examination as part of the moral life, but it's one of the most common themes in Johnson. And we know that she liked Johnson. Fanny Price in Mansfield Park has a copy of The Idler sitting in her kind of special little East room where she goes to kind of reflect and be by herself. So there's a lot there. And yeah, stay tuned for the book, I guess. Who knows when that will come out.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll be looking forward to it.
Absolutely. As we start to kind of draw to a close, could you maybe summarize anything in particular you think our listeners could take away from the life of Johnson? What are some of the big truths about life, about the Christian struggle for holiness, Christian engagement in the secular world? What can we take away and apply to our own lives?
Yeah, so I think to answer this question, I will start with a short anecdote, which is that Johnson was famous for not reading books cover to cover. He would pick up a book, read a few pages, and if he got bored, he would throw it to the side, which is funny when we think of him as this great man of letters, that he usually couldn't read books cover to cover. But there were only 3 books that he wished were longer and that he read and exhausted them and wanted them to be longer. One was Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. One was Don Quixote, which in my opinion is long enough, maybe too long. So it's
Yes.
astonishing to me that he wished it were longer. And the third was The Pilgrim's Progress. And Walter Jackson Bate, Johnson's kind of most famous modern biographer, who I mentioned earlier, points out that all three of these books are about pilgrims. They're about kind of wayfarers, people who are making their way through the world. So I think Johnson, this is really, if you were to describe Johnson in one word, I think it's a pilgrim, right? He's journeying through life, right? He's never at home anywhere. And I think he's aware that part of the reason why we suffer is so that we're never, right? So that it directs our hopes to heaven, right? If we're too comfortable in this world, then we're likely to lose our way on that journey. So I really see Johnson as someone who is very encouraging, someone who is kind of just a few steps ahead of me as a reader, and who has a kind of penetrating insight and can be quite cynical, frankly. But there's something that brings a lot of consolation reading Johnson when he fearlessly faces these difficult truths about the pain, sometimes feelings of hopelessness and despair, kind of journeying through this world. So that's the distillation. Yeah.
I think it's a really beautiful picture of perseverance. Very often we think of perseverance as having faith in the face of challenges and doubts, and you kind of like speak very confidently against these challenges and doubts, whereas the portrayal of Johnson that you just gave us as someone who was accurately aware of his own failures, and there are times of spiritual defeat and despair, and yet he was able to hold on to this faith, however imperfectly. And then we see this picture, not so much a picture of some immense strength, but I think very much God's love and protection as well, which I thought was very encouraging.
Yeah, I think he always doubted himself, but I think ultimately he never really doubted God. Even when it maybe seemed like that to him, even if he doubted God's existence, I don't think I think he thought of that as more of a fault in himself.
It was also like throughout his life, God was still sort of holding on to him, even when he felt tempted to give up, which I thought was absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
And for our listeners who want to learn more about Johnson, would you recommend they look at that Bate biography, or anything else you'd recommend?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a choose your own adventure kind of thing, I would say. There are a few good places to start. One, you could start with a biography. And I think starting with a biography is really good because Johnson's life is as interesting as his writings in a lot of ways. So there's the Walter Jackson Bate biography. There's also a new book called The Club by Leo Damrosch that I highly recommend. It came out a few years ago. It's more of a group biography. So if you want to learn more about Johnson's kind of intellectual circles and what it looked like to live in 18th century England, Johnson is featured very heavily in this book, but you also learn about other figures as well. So The Club is very good. I would recommend an abridged version of Boswell's life of Johnson. There's a good one from Penguin. Don't not read the unabridged version, but when I read it, I kept fantasizing about how I would abridge it because it's so long. And Boswell really needed an editor, and he'll go on these kind of rants about, a legal case he's working on, and he asks Johnson advice for legal advice, and it's a lot. So an abridged Boswell's life. If you want to also read some of what Johnson wrote, I would say Rasselas. This is a short 100-page novel. In a lot of ways, I think it's the summation of his moral thinking for about a decade. He famously wrote it in the course of a week, pay for his mother's funeral. That's the legend.
Wow. Another
good place to start with Johnson is, in his own writings, are his periodical essays from the Rambler or from the Idler, and you can just you can get a Oxford or Penguin edition of Johnson's major works, and the essays are very short. They're only like 2 or 3 pages. So there's, ones on procrastination, all sorts of topics. So those are, again, this is a choose your own adventure, whatever appeals to you most.
Fantastic.
Very nice.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. It's been such a privilege to have you on the podcast. And I know I've learned an awful lot about Samuel Johnson that I did not know before. And I'm sure our listeners will agree. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us again. And we'll be in your ears again next week. Take care.
Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.